Casey, welcome to Memory Safe. Thank you for coming onto the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
How are you doing today? How are
Doing
things?
well, doing well. Fast and furious. It's a Monday here, so it's all of the Monday things getting up and rolling. But it's great to chat.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you taking the time, especially on a Monday, because I know it's how crazy it gets. This podcast, we're asking the same 10 questions to different guests across the cybersecurity industry. And that's really the premise. And it's really cool to see how different people are answering these different questions.
Lots of different
So
stories. Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot there, and it really kind of is a range of answers. So let's just start with question number one here. When did you get your first computer?
Yeah, I actually didn't get per se a computer for myself until pretty much the end of high school. But I had a lot of exposure to computers. The first time my computer came home was 1987. It was an Apple IIe. My dad was a science teacher, so one of the things he'd do is he'd take me to school. Like he could see that I was really interested in technology and all those different things. He'd take me to the high school that he taught at when I was in elementary school. And at some point, a computer just showed up and kind of stayed in the house for longer than I was maybe expecting it to. But that was what I considered to have been my first computer.
That's awesome. So you weren't like, "Mom, Dad, can I have a computer?" It just kind of showed up there,
I
and
was we weren't. No, yeah, I mean it was I was using the school's kit and dad was definitely trying to help make that happen, which is pretty cool.
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I feel like we had kind of in my household, we had like the shared family computer experience, like one in the living room, and then everyone kind of cycled through to use
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah, no, we definitely did that with in terms of having our just like actually developing a base platform. It was kind of an interesting way to learn how to glom onto computing as well because we didn't have a single system. I had friends who were like Commodore 64 people. I had friends that were Apple IIe people. That's kind of the era that I cut my teeth on, and they all ended up with some amount of kind of platform lock-in, which I managed to avoid in hindsight in those early days because I was just chopping and changing between different things. Actually, prior to me getting my own computer, the first computer that was in the home was an Amiga. I think it was an Amiga 4000. My dad actually ended up going from he was a media teacher. He was a science teacher that ended up moving into actually creating a media course and teaching that. And
Oh,
at the
cool.
time, the Amiga 4000 was like the bee's knees of
Yeah.
graphics computers that you could have for home use. So that was probably
Mhm.
the first one that I was tinkering on, more consistently.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to your point about like platform lock-in too, I do feel like that's such a bigger thing nowadays too, with the Apple platform and how kids are growing up using that versus other things.
Yeah.
So
Well, I
yeah.
think I think this was the early days of that because I'm still, I don't consider myself like I've run Linux as a daily driver for a chunk of time. I ran Windows as a daily driver for a chunk of time. Like these days, I'm back on Apple.
Mhm.
And it's not so much because I don't consider myself to be an Apple fanboy, so to speak, because every platform has its strengths and its weaknesses. It's just the thing that I'm most used to. So
Yeah.
the kind of the earlier that kicks off, I do think that Apple, just from like a business standpoint, their whole idea of basically saturating the education space and just waiting, which I think
Yeah.
is a lot of what they did. I'm ultimately kind of a product of that from
Yeah.
a generation standpoint, which is pretty remarkable foresight on their part from a business perspective.
Yeah, it's crazy how it's played out all
Yeah,
these years and where that's gotten us now.
absolutely, absolutely.
Um, so this is kind of actually leads into this second question, which it sounds like you delved into a little bit, but when did you first go online? And I think this is kind of a funny question because for me personally, I don't really like have a like. This was like I'm online now,
You're
but
going to get a huge range of
some
answers.
people are different.
Yeah, for
So
sure. I mean, I think the funnest answer to that one, it's like, I saw a tweet, are you burning a CD years old? And then someone responded with, I'm recording from the radio onto a boombox years old. And these kind of different, you can sort of date people based on their answer to stuff like that.
great.
Yeah, for me, it was. So I first connected into DARPANET and did kind of internet stuff again through school.
Mhm.
Um, that was in elementary school, so that was late 80s. But the first time I was like you start to put the independent study hat on, and kind of the origins of some of the more hackery type bits and pieces. That was 1991. My friend had a Maestro 56K modem. And we basically were jumping onto bulletin boards and all sorts of different stuff. It was actually funny. I was thinking about this when I saw your questions earlier, like seeing the Jolly Roger handbook and the Anarchist cookbook and some of these different text files that floated around at the time.
Mhm.
And it kind of spelled out in text format, this universe of different places that you can connect with people and learn, at the time, kind of mischievous stuff, which was sort of what we're into. And
Yeah.
that was kind of how it all got kicked off. So that was 1990, 1991 ish.
Yeah, yeah, it's so funny how that's, like, evolved over time too in terms of, like, it was pretty siloed then, but
Yeah,
now it's
yeah.
very
Well,
much,
and
yeah,
this, and you still had the funny part about that is that with BBS, you still had the whole, your mum would pick up the phone on the same line and it'd drop the call, or like you'd have to
yeah,
wait because the internet's on and all that sort of stuff, which is a completely foreign concept to
yeah,
to people that went around for that particular season of connecting. Like once, always on broadband arrived, that was ADSL when it first landed in Australia. We didn't have like cable and fiber for a little bit longer than the US, because
yeah,
that country is a bit more difficult to wire up than this one.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, that was like magic. It's like, oh, you mean I can make phone calls with my telephone and also
yeah.
be on the internet at the same time? Mind blown. Which is
It's
a funny thing.
Our kids are just never gonna have to know, like, the challenges that we had to, like, the
Yeah,
dial-up ringtone and things like that, and
yeah, I've been thinking about that a bit lately, because they'll never understand the plumbing and what's actually going on in the way that my generation would. But at the same time, I see with my kids, they're bouncing around the app layer and just considering the internet as their kind of native world that they live in a way that I
Right.
probably can't,
Mhm.
because that's, I can sort of empathize with it, and I've tried to learn a lot about it, but it's not where I grew up, if that makes sense. So there's
Yeah.
kind of differences in the generations and how they view technology. I think there's strengths and weaknesses to each.
Yeah, yeah, and just, like, the user interface that they're probably gonna be dealing with when they're, as young
Yeah,
as how I don't even know how
that
old
one
they're
breaks
gonna
my
be.
brain. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's a, that's a whole that's a whole thing. You talk about chatbots, you talk about kind of the normalization of AR and VR
Yeah.
and different things like that. It's like it's gonna, you fast forward 10 years and wonder what it's going to be like. It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, I can make some guesses, but to make predictions is a little tricky that far out.
Yeah, no, I won't even try to predict anything because 'cause I'm just like, I don't know what's gonna be the new thing in, like, 5 years, and in some cases, I don't wanna know, so
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Um, alright, and so here the next question here is a little more, like, related to cybersecurity, but, like, what
Sure.
was your first exposure to hacker culture?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it before, like, and when I say hacker culture, I'm answering that question in context of, yeah, thinking like a criminal but not wanting to be one, which is a phrase I use quite a lot. That was, Jolly Roger handbook and Anarchist cookbook,
Mhm.
and some of those kind of different things where it's like, hey, here's all of this stuff that you can do. I grew up, as I mentioned, with a science teacher for a father, and he was pretty. His approach to teaching and his approach to technology just in general was to, in hindsight, it was to teach kids how to hack. It's this
Mhm.
idea of like, okay, here's all of the stuff that I'm going to teach you as courseware, but I want you to go off and like tear it all apart and put it back together and come up with your own conclusions, because that's how you learn how to think, not just how to memorize stuff.
Right.
Which obviously is a kind of a approach to learning that I took on. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, like thinking about that with some of those text files, it's like, oh, cool, we can learn how to blow crap up. As
Yeah.
a kid, in Australia, in the outer suburbs of Sydney, where it's basically just bushland, and you kind of just run around trying to find things to do most of the time. There was nothing nefarious about it. It was just really fun. And
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I had a bunch of friends that had a similar kind of mindset to that type of thing. So that was, I think, the combination of thinking like that and then learning how to access it online and then learning how to kind of build on that.
Mhm.
That was, it's not strictly speaking hacking, but um, I think there was some crossovers between hacker culture and some of that stuff.
Mhm.
And then pretty quickly kind of, jumped off into the Wes scene for a bit and all that kind of stuff. Like there was a lot of adjacencies that grew it's funny because I was never a huge into gaming.
Mhm.
Um, I got no problem with people that are. It just never kind of grabbed me in the way that I've seen it grab other people. But there's a lot of adjacency between, early reverse engineering and
Mhm.
people who were trying to crack, activation codes for games in
Yeah.
particular, and that moved off into software and all that other stuff. So this was around that time when all of
Mhm.
those things were being shared and people were starting to, you know, kind of, I guess, build a definition around what the heck we're actually doing. It's like, okay, we're basically traversing all of these different things that other people are creating, and then, as I'm also known to say, tipping those things upside down, or the assumptions of those things upside down, and seeing what falls out and seeing if we can reconstruct something better
Yeah.
out of that. So I see that kind of as my early, exposure to hacker culture, and that was around the same time, kind of late '80s, early '90s.
Yeah, yeah, and I really think it's interesting all the different definitions of what hacker culture actually is, and I do
Yeah.
think that, like, to your point, there is kind of, um, almost like a personal aspect to each individual answer. Like, you mentioned, like, your dad being, a teacher, a science teacher, and I
Yep.
think that that does always have some sort of influence in who you're interacting with and
Yep.
how you view kind of what you're doing. So,
100%.
yeah.
I think it like that particular period, we were just literally making shit up.
Yeah.
Like there was no there was no courseware, there was no, kind of cybersecurity, kind of career pathway, because cybersecurity didn't really exist as an industry yet at
Right.
all. Like we're still trying to figure out the plumbing,
Mhm.
not how to secure it, right? Um, and I think that's very different to today. Again, there's strengths and weaknesses to each. I don't see that as like, the good times and now it's like easy mode or anything like that,
Yeah.
because all sorts of other things have changed in the process. But
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think, the association between hacker and criminal, I think that was sort of starting to emerge at that point in time, but it wasn't there when I started. Like for us, it was just curiosity, like
Mhm.
pure. There was no, even how I was framing up these like, criminal manuals that we were kind of reading as kids. That wasn't because we wanted to be criminal. It's because we were curious about cool stuff that we could do, like make things go bang, and not,
Mhm.
not to cause any harm. It's just because it's fun as a, 13, 14 year old.
Yeah. No.
And it was the curiosity that was kind of driving it, and then the tenacity of actually continuing to persist to look for that stuff and figure out how to make it work. Like to me, you go back to some of the early, like the mentors document, like curiosity and tenacity are kind of called out as the core character
Mhm.
traits of a hacker. And I'm pretty deliberate with how I define hacker to make it agnostic of anything that's even remotely criminal. Like
Right.
I think
Yeah.
for me and my friends, we had this mischief streak that was always kind of running in the background, so it kind of pulled it in
Mhm.
that direction. But I don't think that that's necessarily, um, that's not a necessary ingredient to
Mhm.
being a hacker. I think it's that idea of like, no, I think I could do something different with that. And then,
Yeah. Yeah. Like you were mentioning, like, just, like, the tinkering aspect of
yep,
all of it, wanting to know how things work, I think
yep.
is really something that, a lot of people I've talked to is, how they view kind of what goes into the culture as well.
Yeah, and then what you do with it really depends on what motivated you to get there in the first place, and then your
Mhm.
environment. How you kind of encourage, like this, you can sort of see some of the origins of what got me into doing the policy stuff and Disclose.io, kind of in my origin story as well. Because that
Yeah.
whole idea of like, no, this is like thinking bad but doing good, like that was really misunderstood, and I actually got to watch that kind of grow and become a dominant thing at that point in time. So,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think as well. I mean, calling it out. I was pretty involved, pretty involved in like youth groups and social work and all those different things. So like, I had all of these different environments that I was in. There was some that would definitely could have taken me off down the wrong path, or
Yeah.
a path that would have created a different outcome, and probably possibly not as good an outcome. But then
Right.
I had these sort of nurturing environments that were trying to basically keep me on the straight and narrow, more or less. Not
Mhm.
too strictly, because that's not something that I necessarily allow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Minority, but you get what I mean. Like the idea
Yeah.
of like,
Yeah.
hey, let's try to help,
Yeah.
you know, Casey like grow up big and strong, and help him to do the same with others, and all those different things. That was a pretty big influence through this season that I don't often talk about.
Huh.
And just calling that part out as well, because I do think that played a pretty major role.
Yeah, that's really interesting too. Just kind of, like hearing those experiences and like, knowing kind of what is kind of like a good path to go down and what isn't, especially when you kind of
Yeah,
do, yeah, look at.
and like you said before, there's many roads to Rome, but yeah, you're asking the question. I think that part of it is definitely something that deserves a shout out, and something that I don't take any credit for. You know what I mean? Like that was just the environment that I grew up in, and I do think it played a role.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Well, actually, this next question here, I'm kind of curious to hear your answer to as well, because this somewhat relates when we're talking about kind of personal experiences, and
Sure.
when you look at your own path, like when you were going through all this, like when did you think you might make cybersecurity a career? Like when were you like, this is something that I could do as a job? You know?
Yeah, it was after I'd finished high school, and I'd actually, I'd never considered computers as a career.
Mhm.
I'd always thought about them as a means to an end. So, all through high school, I'm like, what am I going to do when I grow up? I don't know, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
Like literally the thought never occurred to me until later on. I'll get to that in a sec. But basically, what I did at the end of high school was I did a gap year, which is a thing that Australians do. We don't tend to go from high school straight to college. We'll take a year off because we often, there's like 5 major cities in Australia in total. So we oftentimes end up going to university in the same town that we went to high school in. So we have our
Oh,
little,
nice.
foray into the world and then come back and get off into that stuff. So I did that, and I was actually going to become a doctor. I'd basically gotten into a nuclear medicine degree, which
Okay.
was sort of a combination of technology and interest in physics and all those different things, and then this like I want to do something helpful kind of
Mhm.
streak. I think sort of coming together. But I did probably about 6 weeks of that degree, and I'm like, I don't really know why I'm here. Like I'm only doing this because someone told me that it was the thing that I needed to do next after high school.
Yep.
So I dropped out before student debt kicked in, basically, which was not a bad call in hindsight.
Yeah.
Um, Again, many roads to Rome. I don't want to poo poo higher education, but some people it's the right thing for them, and for other people it's not necessarily the best thing.
Right.
But at that point, like literally, I met a guy who was an entrepreneur who was doing a cybersecurity or just sorry an IT startup, just
Mhm.
network engineering, all that kind of stuff. And he kind of grabbed me one day, took me out to lunch, and said, "Hey, do you want to? I think you could probably do this stuff. Do you want to come on as an apprentice and we'll see
Mhm.
where it goes from there." I said, yeah, well, I'm not really, haven't really got much else to do right now. And I don't really have any sort of sense of direction. So I'll
Yeah.
give it a shot. It seems interesting.
Yeah.
Um, and that worked out. I think not very long into doing that, he started to trust me with taking on work for clients and all those different things. And as a part of that, I started to apply some of the things I knew from a security context, especially offensively. Like if I saw there was something set up in a way that was risky, I'd
Mhm.
find a way to prove or demonstrate that risk, and then take that to the people that I needed to convince, basically, that there was a problem that needed to be solved there.
Mhm.
And there's some funny stories out of learning how to do that well, because I definitely didn't. I had to learn a lot of stuff kind of the hard way through that season. But that was really my
Yeah.
introduction to pen testing and to security as a career, like IT and security. As a potential career path. And yeah, I've pretty much been doing it ever since. I mean, that was 2001, I think.
Mhm.
So this is when wireless is just starting to come out, like the summer of worms in 2003, and the trustworthy computing memo
Yeah.
out of out of Microsoft, that was 2003 as well. Pretty much the internet was just a barrel full of fish that you could shoot at, and
Yeah.
things that happen. Like the internet security looked very, very different at that point in time. It actually looks similar today to what it did back then, because I think we got secure and then started going so fast that we kind of forgot to do security again. But that's a
Yeah.
whole other thing.
It always comes in waves like that, you
I
know?
think I
Yeah.
think so. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this was. I do think that this was kind of the first wave of awareness of internet insecurity, because prior to
Mhm.
that, there kind of really wasn't an internet. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
but yeah, that was kind of how you know, how I got my start. And it was actually the blaster worm that was the thing that got me hooked, because at that point in time, I'd been doing a ton of wireless stuff and
Mhm.
really enjoying that. I'd started to get into reverse engineering and exploit kind of work, and I saw MSO 3026, which is the vuln that became Blaster Drop, and started playing with some of the exploits that were getting put together. I'm like, this is going to be a wormable. Like, this is obviously wormable as a vulnerability, but this is going to become a worm basically within, I think I predicted 2 weeks, and it came out 11 days later.
Oh man, that's
Yeah,
wild. Yeah.
yeah, which was like, okay, I love this. This is great.
Yeah.
Because at that point in time, it's like, okay, I could step at least to some degree into the mind of the bad guys. I'm kind of enjoying playing with the technology. I'm seeing things happen that kind of validate the fact that I'm pointing roughly in the right direction, and I
Yeah.
kind of got hooked at that point, because it felt good, and we're in a position to actually, you know, help people get ahead of some of that stuff at the time, because that thing completely trashed the internet, and prompted a whole lot of change.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting too, is like kind of having the like helping others aspect of that, because when you were mentioning the kind of alternate wanting to be like more of a doctor and potentially helping others there, I think that it's good to note that this is another kind of career path that also can do that as well in a different way, but like
Yeah.
still be have the same like an impact for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you think about it, you know, you hear people say a lot. Well, you know, in cybersecurity, we're not like curing cancer and blah blah blah, which is, you know, true, right? But
Mhm.
when you look at what happened in 2020 with COVID,
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
kind of, I wouldn't say we cured cancer, but we put a lot of work in to make sure that you know, there wasn't disruption to, or there was, you know, minimized disruption where we could, to things that were pretty critical and pretty, you know, challenging from a just life standpoint. So it's
Yeah.
one of those ones where I feel like those things have come full circle time and time again. It's actually one of the things that's drawn me towards safety critical um,
Mhm.
security as well. I think a lot of people in that particular space, they have this crossover of like backstories and skill sets going into it. They wanted to do something in health or safety or whatever,
Mhm.
and ended up getting kind of sucked into this black hole vortex of cybersecurity, and all of a sudden those things start to merge at some point in the future.
Yeah, no, but I do love that kind of space, because I do think everyone who I've talked to that's in that space is like so passionate about it, and
Yeah.
it is like you said, like it is critical. So um
It's critical, and people. I mean, honestly, I think one of the things about it too is that people care about it. You know,
mhm.
you talk about you know, data loss, you talk about privacy, you talk about, you know, some of the more some of the less physically impacting or visceral kind of consequences of doing security poorly, and they're more difficult to explain and to
Mhm.
get people to actually pay proper attention to try to reduce risk. Whereas when you're talking about, yeah, making sure a car can't have the airbag remotely activated while you're on the highway, that's a pretty easy, you know,
Yeah.
that's a pretty easy story to tell as
Yeah.
to why that's actually an important thing to do. So
True, it is definitely easier to kind of describe to, friends and family why.
more people are going to get that. They're going to, oh,
Yeah.
that's bad. Okay, tell me more about this, you know,
Yeah.
underlying layer that might make
Right.
that possible, and how I can think about it differently.
Absolutely. Yep. Um All right. So it looks like we kind of touched on question 5, which is what was your alternate
Yep, we
career
did.
idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes. So question 6 here is who was your hacker hero, or is your hacker hero?
Yeah, actually, let me just touch on, because these two are tied together as well. The other alternate career idea is, I actually didn't really have it in my head to do entrepreneurship or business until probably 2006 or so. And in hindsight, I'd always been thinking about tinkering and invention and all those different things. To me, that was sort of one of my byproducts of hacking. I didn't put that together in terms of actually becoming an executive and doing the company thing until about that time. So,
Yeah.
you know, alternate career idea, there's a lot of different things that I was playing with. I actually ended up building an import export business around audio gear in Australia for a period of time, which wasn't, that was sort of an accident, but you know, I didn't sort of view it as a career, but it became quite large at that point.
Oh
And there
wow.
was, you know, a bunch of different kind of directions that could have potentially gone.
Yeah.
not so much an alternate career idea, but different expressions of entrepreneurship and founding, which is ultimately, when I introduce myself these days, I'm like, what do you do? I'm a founder.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing that I sort of landed on, if that makes sense. So yeah, so
Well,
Hacker Hero, I would
yeah.
say it's actually, I had to think about this one. I actually say it's Nikola Tesla, um,
Yeah.
and because his the way that he modeled
Mhm.
ideas, the way that he kind of, he had this way of basically constructing the thing that you wanted to achieve, and sort of being able to get it to a point where he could visualize it and then manipulate that visualization to create the thing that he wanted. I read that, I'm like, that's exactly how my head works, which was as a whatever 8 or 9 year old, that was kind of
Yeah.
cool. Um, and again, strictly speaking, was he a hacker? Well, not by today's common definition, but he hacked how we do power. He hacked how we do radio. He hacked how we do communications. He predicted the mobile phone like 120 years ago and almost got it spot on accurate.
Right.
So as a futurist and someone who thought like that, he's always been a hero of mine. Even before his name was kind of cool in that sense. Um, but outside of
Yeah.
that, I'd say Was and Semi Kemker. So was definitely like digging into like, how did you think about building a computer in the first place, in that season, and then Sammy with this sort of hacktivism for the sake of growing public awareness around insecurity, and then driving attention towards security research and trying to encourage others to do the same. The whole MySpace worm thing was, I thought that was actually pretty cool, and it's great to have been able to get to know Sammy since then.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah, I feel like it's so funny, like just hearing different people's answers to that, because there is like a, like you were saying, like, hey, like this person is describing or doing like how kind of my mind works. Like there is like a personal aspect to it when it comes to cybersecurity as well. So
yeah, no, definitely. I think everyone, you and I've talked about this a bunch of times. It's kind of one of the foundational ideas behind Bugcrowd. It's like everyone has their own backstory and experience that goes into how they think, and everyone has their own wiring that kind of takes that backstory and applies it in a different way. And I think the more diversity you can have in that,
Mhm.
the better equipped you are to defend and actually outsmart the bad guys trying to figure out what mistakes we've made, right? But I think as well, that's just sort of inherent to cybersecurity as a space. Like I love, there's this interesting skills cluster or interest cluster where there's a lot of musicians, in kind of my sort of generation of security practitioner, and I put that down to this combination of learning like leadership and communication through music, and the fact that music is actually, it's math, like it's actually like
Mhm.
incredibly scientific. It just doesn't, that's not the point of it. The point of it is to communicate something that doesn't feel like math at all. So there's these sort of
Right.
things that if you can kind of glom onto that, if you've already glommed onto that as a person and you're a performing musician,
Mhm.
I have a theory that you're more likely to find this stuff easier than
Mhm.
people don't, because that's just a part of your wiring. So there's all these little things that
Yeah.
pop up when you look around that are quite cool.
Yeah, and that even extends like obviously music, but then like art and a
Yeah.
couple of other, industries where you
There's lots of
never
them.
know.
That's the
Yeah.
example I can empathize with, but there's tons of others too, I think.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, this is actually kind of related, but what is your favorite hacker movie and why? We just, this is kind of a fun question.
Yeah, yes, I love Sneakers. Like Sneakers was probably the first one for me that was like, oh, that's badass. I could like
Yeah.
probably build a career out of this. And it's it turned out to be kind of prophetic in a lot of ways. Like it's one of those movies where when you look at some of the stuff that came out with the Snowden leaks and whatever else, it's like, whoa, they weren't far off. And that was
Yeah.
when that kind of information was not anywhere near as available as it became in 2013. So I
Right.
love that one. But I actually came to fall in love with Hackers, the movie, later in life, which
Mhm.
is a funny one because usually it's, I think, maybe the other way around. But Hackers as an expression of the community and culture.
Mhm.
Like I sat around literally during COVID,
Mhm.
and watched a bunch of like hackers like tear up at different points. It was like I think it was the 25th or 26th anniversary of hackers,
Yeah.
and they're like getting emotional because for them it's like this movie got me when nothing else did.
Hmm.
This movie actually, like,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous, it's absurd. There's aspects of it that are just completely technically inaccurate and all of those
Mhm.
different things, right? But the way that it tried to communicate the hacker community and the hacker spirit, um, is something that they really deeply related to,
Mhm.
which I kind of I was right on the fringes of that, partly being in Australia and partly being a little bit late to the game.
Mhm.
But to see them like be that affected by it was pretty cool.
Yeah, and like you and at Bugcrowd, like you do a ton of kind of work with hackers and understanding kind of the mindset there and the
Yeah.
community, and so I feel like that makes total sense for you to kind of look at it that way as well.
Yeah, just trying to figure out what are the things that tie us together that are fundamental, because obviously those, like, what the community looks like is going to evolve, as time
Right.
goes by, as new people come into it, as it grows. Because I mean, you talk about, DEF CON this year was whatever it was, 28,000 people, some odd.
Hmm.
Um, like, what was it, 1995 when hackers came out, it was the second year of DEF CON. It was probably three or 400.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it looks different today, right? But
yeah.
it's like, what are those fundamentals? And I do think it's like this, this idea of just tenacity, expression, like curiosity, diversity. Like, Hackers was pretty incredible in terms of how diverse its cast was when you think about,
Yeah.
when it was made,
Right.
even down to, the wardrobe and all those different things. Plus, it was my introduction to Angelina Jolie, so there is also that. That was a
Yeah. Yeah. You can't go wrong there. Love her.
yeah. All the guys will probably throw that answer out, and
Yeah. Yep.
women as well. She's just a badass.
Yeah, yep, it's just kind of like the cherry on top, so
I think so. Yeah.
um all right, so question 8 here, and I like this one because it is kind of brings us to the future here, but or
Sure.
the current, I guess. But how do you describe your job?
Yeah. So, I mean, I introduced myself as the founder and CTO of Bugcrowd and the co-founder of the Disclose.io project. Bugcrowd is really the pioneer of crowdsourced security as a service. So we didn't, invent bug bounty or vulnerable disclosure. All of that was prior art, but we were the first ones to basically create a platform that, you know, took this idea of all of this ingenuity that exists out in the hacker community, and a lot of the stuff that we were just talking about, and basically plugging it into the problems, engineering it into the gaps that exist in cybersecurity defense.
Mhm.
Um, at the time, early on, so started the company in 2012 and been at it ever since. And at the time, really, the idea was like, how do we get companies ahead of the adversary when it comes to discovering vulnerabilities, like no matter what we might be attacking next. At the time, we weren't talking about ChatGPT or, connected cars or any of that other stuff. It's like, this is
Yeah.
always going to evolve. Therefore, human creativity is always going to play a part in figuring out what's next at the very least.
Mhm.
And a lot of what I do today is basically the same thing, just in a much faster moving internet with a much larger community. With like 100 million odd raised in the bank to do it with, and a kick-ass
Mhm.
team and all those different things.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, like I think that's my job these days is really seeing around the next set of corners in terms of how we need to think about deploying the creativity of the community next.
Mhm.
What kind of community needs to be assembled in order to do that? How do we actually understand who they are through the tech that we've built out? All those different things, and then there's a lot of evangelism, a lot of explaining, a lot of like, you still have to explain what a hacker is to a lot of people. I think that default, like, fear reaction I wouldn't say it's gone away, but it's not anywhere near as strong as it used to be.
Mhm.
But even if you're not bumping into that, you've still got to explain the fact that no, we're not criminal. We think like we're able to think like them, but that's not why we're
Mhm.
here.
Right.
So a fair bit of time on that as well. And the other part on Disclosure is really around. So I mentioned, like, connects the like change connects security creativity with security problems, and that's the bug crowd side of things. And then
Mhm.
Disclose.io is really to change the operating environment for people that hack in good faith.
Mhm.
Because, a lot of that fear basically resulted in laws being made that's kind of assume that what we do is criminal.
Mhm.
And it's been like that now for going on 35 or 40 years. Um,
Right.
Starting to change, and that change is starting to accelerate, which is awesome. And I think that's largely a byproduct of things like Disclose.io and the work of myself and others to basically
Yeah.
keep consistent pressure on trying to improve that operating environment for people that do what we do. So that's kind of my job.
Yeah, and that's gotta feel really good to see that change kind of and the needle
It
moving
is.
forward there, you know?
Yeah, it's a funny one because I always see the broken things and I kind of look at the ideal future state compared to the broken things, and they always still feel kind of broken. Like there's
Yeah.
so much to do still
Mhm.
in that sense. But if I stop and look back at what we've achieved over the past 10 years, it's pretty awesome. There's a lot of pretty amazing changes that have happened. It's definitely a very different operating environment for people that do the kind of things that we do. Both the folk from my generation and like this kind of steady stream of new folks that are coming in these days. So I think that's
Right.
pretty incredible. And probably the other part with that is just encouraging entrepreneurs and talking to founders. I love the opportunity to share. I do mentoring, some investment advisory, all those different things, and I love the opportunity to share like the things that I did well and the things I completely screwed up,
Mhm.
and learn from. Because as a like security is full of innovators, I think we're naturally good at figuring out the solution to the next set of problems because of that whole tip the things upside down description I gave
Right.
before, right?
Yeah.
But oftentimes we either lack the business skill because that's just not what we've learned or grown up in, or we lack
Mhm.
the confidence because we feel like it's never going to be a perfect solution. So
Mhm.
like helping founders and entrepreneurs bridge that gap, I spend a decent chunk of time doing that as well, and that's a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. And actually that does kind of go right into the next question too about what was your biggest mistake and what was your proudest moment? So when we're looking at kind of the things that have gone wrong versus the things that have been awesome. So would love to hear what you have there.
Yeah, wow. And I wish I'd. This is one of those ones where I was going through and trying to get some quick answers to the others, but this one I kind of locked up on a little bit. Biggest mistake. I mean, honestly, I think all of them go down to not being. Yeah, any time where I've um, not backed myself when I knew I should have.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like most of the things that I sort of count as a mistake, and I'm not saying that's not to say that I'm always right. Like that's far from true. But the idea of like, no, I actually can if I've got this sense of um, mission and this sense of like this is the thing that needs to happen, and then
Hmm.
kind of lack the confidence to really push that through
Hmm.
and kind of step back from that. I think a lot of the things that I would consider to have been mistakes over the years have been a byproduct of that as a fundamental. Um,
Yeah.
Definitely done some things like all of the things that I've seen, like testing out in the early days. I accidentally detonated some malware and caused 20,000 odd dot matrix printers around Australia to spit out um, like basically the code of this particular virus all at the same time, which
Oh,
was which was
yeah.
hilarious in
Yeah.
hindsight, terrifying at the time.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a funny story to tell, but I don't view that as like my biggest mistake because that was one of those ones where it was a two-way door. It's like, oh
Yeah.
crap. At the time there was some cleanup that happened. We got it done and it was fine. There's been a few of those, but yeah, that'd probably be the biggest one. Going back to what I said before, is just if you're in this stuff, like we've all got something to bring,
Mhm.
and we've all got the reason that we're bringing it, and don't let anyone tell you that you can't.
Yeah, that's a good point because I do feel like, and this is more personally for me, but like imposter syndrome and like things like that, like
Yeah,
are something that a lot of people deal with in cybersecurity, and just having that confidence level, and especially when you're at the start of your career or mid career,
yeah.
but even when you've been in it for a
Look,
while.
I mean, I think imposter syndrome is a thing that, like to me, imposter syndrome is it's definitely something to grapple with, and
Mhm.
it can be, all sorts of reasons for it. But I do think in our space, one of the main reasons it's so consistent is that we're kind of academically honest as a job,
Yeah.
right? So like we're looking at what we can bring, and we're like, well, yeah, but that's not perfect. That's not going to be enough, or that's you know creating something new in complete uncertainty. Like
Hmm.
by definition, that makes you an imposter. So yeah, you're gonna have to deal with that.
Right. Yeah.
It's not like running screaming from it. It's I think listening to it's important, but I don't think it being there is necessarily avoidable or even a bad
Yeah.
thing. So it's a balancing act there, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Especially like because I think to your point, like people do want to say yes, but this or like this is true, but then look at it this from this angle. And
Yep.
when we have like our platforms like Twitter and things like that, like that, there's a really good conversation that happens. But then also you're constantly are thinking like, well, is this right? Like, am I doing the right thing here? So
And you're probably 5% wrong, like
yeah,
at least, a decent chunk of
right.
the time. And the trick is finding that 5% and working out how to improve it. Um,
Yeah.
and then having the right people around you to help you do that as well, I think. So yeah.
Um, All right, and then I want to make sure you also talk about your proudest moment. And I realize that question is tough because I think that it is like hard to go through all your, different memories and really pick one thing out.
Yeah, I
And
think I
also,
think people that have been doing this for a while are going to have a fairly long list.
yeah, yeah,
And picking it out because
yeah,
we are in the business of mistakes as well. There is that too. But yeah, proudest moment I would say two. One was actually sort of fairly recently, and this happens. Like I love it when it happens. It happens every now and then. I had someone who we invited to an event 5 or 6 years ago, who's since gotten into security and become really successful, like gifted hardware hacker, basically saying, "Hey, like I just wanted to thank you for and Bugcrowd for inviting me to that event because had I not, gone down this career path, I'd probably be basically in crime because of
mhm,
his environment, his family environment, all those different things. I'm trying to be careful in how I frame this, not to dox the guy, but
yeah, yeah,
um, just that kind of idea of like this literally changed the course of my trajectory away from a life of crime to something
right,
that's actually quite positive. It's something that I'm loving. It's something that I've built community around, all those different things. So like
mhm,
those happen, like I said, then it's not like an everyday thing, but when it happens, it's all the feels because that's just, I think, an
yeah,
incredibly cool byproduct of, mentoring the next generation as best we can. And probably the other part, honestly, would be seeing the DOJ do their charging rule changes around CFAA. Actually, seeing that recognition of
yeah,
hackers as a solution, not just a problem. That was May
mhm,
of 21, and that was at the end of pushing on that one for 6 years or more.
mhm,
So to see that one finally crack and break through, this is actually a hard one as well because there's a lot of really cool things that have happened along the way. Some that I'd take credit for personally, and
mhm.
most of them, frankly, just things that we're a part of that we got to see change because it's been very much a team sport to change the way that the internet thinks about us.
It is, yeah, and I'm sure you, like, had a, bottle of champagne that you cracked or
Yeah,
during that
that's pretty cool.
DOJ announcement. But yeah, it's so true, and there's a lot of really good things that happen in this space, even though it's kind of where we talk a lot about the bad things and the things that could go wrong, but I love to hear stories like that are
It's
positive.
remarkable how far we've all come. And I think it is, going back to what I was saying before. I think it is good to stop every now and then, individually, and just look at the things that are important to us and kind of list them out because we can always see the next set of trash fires that are coming over the hill and look at all of the things that are broken right now, and everything's we're built on top of unintended consequences in industry, so that'll always be true, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But when you think about how far we've come, it's like, wow, we're actually playing with things that can affect a better outcome for users and for people that we care about, like in a way that's radically different to
Mhm.
what it looked like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or even when I started here.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I actually would like to end on this note just because you were like, this is very positive and,
Yeah.
it's Monday and I'm like, this is great. But I want to make sure we get to the 10th question here, which is, what is your best piece of security advice? Yeah, would love to know.
Build it like it's broken, which is a thing that I throw around a lot from an engineering standpoint. But I think it applies to security just in general. Like the idea of being able to forever keep the bad guys out. That's just not. It's not a rational way to think about security. And I think it
Mhm.
applies. When I try to answer questions like that, I always try to answer with something that's going to work for corporate, small business and the user as
Yeah.
well, because otherwise it's going to I get wrapped around trying to pass it out and all that kind of stuff. But this idea of like, no, just assume that you're going to be breached.
Mhm.
Um, and when you think about security, when you think about decisions that you're making, don't let that terrify you and paralyze you from getting on with life, right? But
Mhm.
allow it to just create a little bit of a pause in decisions you make. Allow it to think a little bit differently about how you know look after your assets, look after your friends, look after your data, all those different things. I think the internet just in general encourages us not to think,
Mhm.
and I think that that's only accelerating. And it's because people want products that people use and get joy from, and don't have to kind of preoccupy themselves with all these risk ideas. They just want them to use the thing and have fun, right? So this
Right.
idea of just, well, okay, hang on a sec, like what matters to me?
Mhm.
Um, am I thinking about how I'm looking after those things, and how have I built my decisions and built, where I keep my money, where I keep my data, all those different things in a way that assumes that one day it's going to get breached.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think it's like a fine line between pessimism and realism.
Mhm.
Um, but if people can sort of find their own version of the midpoint between those two ideas, then I think they're going to end up a lot more secure as a result. And that just to me seems like generically useful advice.
Yeah, yeah, I remember, like, I think it was, like, 5 years ago or something, but, like, a couple product marketing teams started throwing out the unhackable term, and security the whole security industry just, like, slapped that away. They were just like, "Nope,
Yeah,
that's not gonna nope, don't do that."
there's no such thing. It's like
Yeah,
information. I think information follows the laws of entropy. So, but when I say between now and the heat death of the universe, everyone's going to get hacked. Like that's as much a physics comment as it is a like. That's just probably what will happen because bad guys are incentivized to make it that way.
yeah,
I just think it's a more rational way to think about things, and if you can find a way to kind of take that idea and, as I said before, not let it paralyze you into
yeah.
like not using anything because that's not a good outcome.
Mhm,
But have it just kind of modify how you think about it, just so you're slowing down a little bit,
mhm.
and making decisions a little bit more thoughtfully. I think that that puts people that do that well ahead of everyone else who basically isn't.
Right, yeah, I love that. So, all right, well, Casey, thank you so much for coming on today, and talking. It was really, really interesting to just hear about, your course through cybersecurity, and, I thought we had a lot of really, really good discussions, so
Likewise, no, appreciate the invite, appreciate the questions, and appreciate you guys putting this together as well. I do think some of these like yeah, especially with all the new folk coming into the space and how quickly that's happening, as we said before, like
yeah,
they'll know things that I'll never understand. Um,
yeah.
but then some of this like how we got there stuff for them to realize that it's hasn't always been the way that it is as they're coming into like a pretty friendly and welcoming and open environment for folks that are trying to make a difference in this space. I think how we got there is a pretty important story for them to at least have their head across.
Yeah, definitely. I think making sure that that is reflected is very important. So,
Very cool. Thank you,
awesome.
Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Casey.
Cheers.
All right, thanks.